When I was 13, I went hunting for an urban legend. I found something much worse. I grew up in the exurbs of western Louisiana. Our small town was deeply religious, and this coupled with the crime wave of the 1980s meant that my childhood was spent largely cooped up inside. The first lick at freedom I got was Halloween night, 1987. I was 13 and was allowed out until midnight with a group of my closest friends. What really sold my mother on the idea was Patrick. Patrick was the 17-year-old brother of my best friend Marv. Despite being feared by anyone younger than him, he was a good student and a good Christian, and all the adults he knew would fawn over him. Against his own will, he'd be accompanying our little group for the night. It was in Marv's family's basement that we watched the first half of Friday the 13th, Part 6 on grainy VHS. Looking back, I'm sure I thought in the moment that that movie would be the most traumatizing thing I'd see all night. When Patrick entered the room, our laughter died mid-sentence. He wasn't tall, but carried himself like he was. I never liked him, but knew that not even his presence could bring down my mood tonight. After Marv's parents forced us out, we patrolled the neighborhood trick-or-treating. I think there were about 5 or 6 of us, not including Patrick. I knew all the other kids from either church or school, apart from Lenny, the kid brother of my friend Rob. I never knew, but I'm sure he was only around 7 or 8. I did remember that he was dressed in a clown costume. Apart from Lenny, the only other costumes I could remember were mine and Marv's. We both came dressed as Ghostbusters, and I'd brought an old black-painted vacuum cleaner with me to really make it. It was after 10, after the trick-or-treating, that maybe 1 or 2 of us left the group to go back home. We all were giggling and messing around, high on sugar, not noticing that Patrick was leading us a little further away from the rows of white houses. The streetlights grew sparse, then vanished altogether. The laughter that had carried us through the night faltered, replaced by the crunch of dead leaves underfoot and the distant, rhythmic croak of bullfrogs. The air thickened with the smell of stagnant water and rotting vegetation. I remember Marv nudging me, his grin faltering for the first time that night. "Dude," he whispered, "where the hell is he taking us?" There was a small marshy clearing on the banks of the bayou. Large, thick roots served as makeshift benches which Patrick directed us onto. Confused, we sat in a crescent around him and watched in terror as he took a cigarette from his pocket, lit the end and took a draw. He blew smoke into Marv's face and started to talk. He told us all that he had a story he wanted to share, a local legend that every kid in town should be aware of. We listened intently as he began telling us about Leatherskin. The story will always stick with me, and I will now try to repeat it as accurately as I can. I might miss out some of the details. It has been 38 years after all, but this will be the truest account of the original myth on the internet, as far as I know anyway. Leatherskin was born sometime in the late 40s or early 50s. Deformed, coarse brown calluses grew all over his body like spreading mycelium. His pus-colored eyes were nothing but tiny pinpricks, and the full set of teeth he was born with were too sharp to be breastfed. His father, the town's pastor, was terrified that his child was a satanic aberration, punishment for the sins of his youth. Despite his ailing wife's pleas, the pastor took his newborn to a murky corner of the swamp and left him in a patch of moss to die. By this point, Patrick had already piqued my interest. At 13, I'd already heard the name Leatherskin whispered before. I heard it from a kid in the playground when I was much younger, in the context that he was going to get me. It was a small part of local lore that I honestly knew nothing about. I didn't even know what Leatherskin was supposed to look like. On that Halloween night, I was ecstatic at the idea of finally getting to know. Unbeknownst to the pastor, he left his unwanted infant crying within earshot of a dilapidated shotgun house. The wooden shaking that was slowly sinking into the bayou was inhabited by an aged and dementia-ridden woman. She wandered from her home and followed the cries to that little patch of moss. When she found the baby, she took him in her arms and cradled him to silence. That night, she brought him back with her and raised him as her own. For years, she fed and clothed him, cared for and nurtured him, and did her best to keep him from harm's way. The senile old woman was barely able to speak herself, and with no other human contact, Leatherskin grew up without a proficiency in any language. His diet consisted of raw seabird and other hapless swamp creatures until he reached puberty. By 13, Leatherskin was already almost 7 feet tall and had just begun to sneak out of his mother's home and into the small town on the other side of the overgrowth. He'd stalk through the backyards at night and kidnap family pets under the cover of darkness. This became his new routine, but as Leatherskin grew, so did his hunger. Sometime in the mid-1960s, a small girl wandered out into the swamp, chasing a monarch butterfly. She was never seen again. From this point onwards, all sympathy had drained from Leatherskin's story. After his first feed on children's flesh, he could not go back. Kids began disappearing at a rate far higher than the national average. After the discovery of some semblance of human remains, The townsfolk would propound that these poor children were falling victim to alligator attacks. Hunts began soon after, and although many reptiles were killed, Leatherskin remained out of sight. The parents, however, stopped letting their children play outside, and especially not near the bayou. Leatherskin was forced to venture further into the small village, and even broke into houses from time to time. It was after one of the Calloway twins disappeared from the edge of the schoolyard that people stopped saying gators and started to nail their windows shut instead. By this time, he had begun to spend much of his time in the water, clambering from root to root in the murky shallows. Anyone who did encounter him might have mistaken Leatherskin for a floating log, or even a crocodilian. Few would have realized how close to death they'd come. Some hunters might have even seen the rundown cabin Leatherskin called home. It rested half-sunken where the marshland met the slow-running waters of the bayou. It was built by the father of Leatherskin's elderly adoptive mother, sometime in the 1870s or 80s, I'd reckon. Back then, where it stood was dry land perched on a small riverbank. With more attraction, it could have developed into a township, taking the place of the one I called home a mile northwards. Shortly after the end of segregation, and immediately after Governor Wallace's loss in the 1968 presidential election, racial tensions in the state of Louisiana were at a fever pitch. Following more sightings and even a blurry photograph of Leatherskin, the highly fantasized story the local newspapers ran with were of a Creole cannibal living deep within the swamp. A racist mob was whipped up, and in one warm July night, they descended into the quagmire accompanied by the sheriff's men. By foot and by boat, the crowd came across Leatherskin's decaying house. Raiding it, they found only the senile octogenarian who'd raised the young demon. She was alive but unresponsive as she had been for the past 2 years. In that time, she'd been kept alive, fed and bathed by her de jure offspring. The gang of men soon realized she wasn't the sole occupant of the house, however, as the wooden frames weren't the only things rotting away. Led into the cramped upstairs by stench alone, they found piles of small bodies, most picked down to the bone. In the ensuing interrogation, the old woman sadly died. This was the beginning of the account from the sole survivor of that night's events, once he regained speech a few days after. He told the reporters encamped around his hospital bed that shortly after, the door was ripped from its hinges. A blur entered the shack and tore the group of men apart, shrugging off gunfire like a metal drum as he did. The lone survivor, a teenaged clerk from Rubio's Hardware, had only done so by leaping out of a brittle, mildew-frosted window. Leaving the screams behind him, he ran, coated in blood, through the maze of vines. In a panic, he twisted his ankle and crawled onto a mossy clearing lit by the moonlight. Eventually, he was found by one of the police boats used in the search, piloted by a bewildered deputy and taken back into town. When a second search party came across the old cabin, they found what was left of the group of men. They were gored to pieces, strewn everywhere. The townsfolk burned the house, and as it went up in flames, its ancient foundations finally gave way and it slid into the murky water. No one knew what happened to Leatherskin, but to this day, our little town still has one of the highest disappearance rates in the contiguous United States. Some say Leatherskin is still alive and well, thriving in the swamp, still feeding on children. At least this was the story told to us by Patrick. Once Patrick finished his yarn, he looked around at the group of kids in front of him, gauging our belief, or a lack thereof. To my side, little Lenny was quivering in his clown costume, his eyes darting around the mangroves. I was conflicted on its validity, but I can remember that with the passion the story was told, I felt inclined to believe him. If I had fully believed him, I might have been less enthusiastic when Patrick quickly suggested that we should all go into the swamp and hunt for Leatherskin ourselves. Since I watched Stand By Me, I yearned for the freedom I had seen in media. With an hour to midnight, I leapt from my seat on the root and fervently supported Patrick's plan. He threw his arm around my shoulder and spoke to the rest of the children, goading them to follow my example. I started to wish that I kept my mouth shut, because 5 minutes later, our little posse was trudging through the swamp. One or two decided not to come with us, instead following the trail back the way we came and into town. A few of us had flashlights, given to us by our overprotective parents. That, combined with the brief cracks of moonlight gazing through the canopy, guided our path. We stuck to the elevated and dry sods of earth as best we could. Despite my attempts, I could feel the hanging ends of my pant leg dampen. Marv and I tried to hang back, and we talked and laughed like a pair of hyenas. The air was wet with sound. Cicadas, toads, and the flow of the nearby bayou. Suddenly, Patrick put a commanding hand up and told us all to stop. We did and looked around, trying to find what sparked our sudden halt. Patrick turned to us with a sinister smile and said that he'd seen movement along the banks of the creek. "It's Leatherskin!" I remember Patrick shouting at us. Lenny's breath hitched as his older brother pushed him forward. Patrick saw what the siblings were doing and decided to take it further. He said something along the lines of, "You're the youngest. Leatherskin will want you." With that, we all started chanting, pressuring the kid to take a few more steps towards the water's edge. Clearly terrified, but even more afraid of what a group of older boys could do to him, he did. In his little white clown suit with blue and red polka dots, he took a series of anxious steps forward as we roared around him. Joking, I shouted, "Oh my God, is that Leatherskin?" Lenny whirled around, almost losing his balance and falling backwards into the water. Tears were streaking down his white face paint now. "Stop it, guys, you're not funny," he screamed as we all bent double, laughing at him. Those words are etched into my mind because they were his last. A torrent of water swept onto the thin, stony bank as a great weight slammed into Lenny, having bitten onto his submerged ankles. He cried out in pain and shock and fell to hands and knees as he was dragged backwards. I was paralyzed with fear, as were Patrick and Marv, but Lenny's brother rushed forward to fight off the black shape. It wasn't until he splashed into the water that we snapped out of our trance of regret and ran to Rob's side. He grabbed him and stopped him from running fully into the bayou as Lenny was dragged underwater by what we came to realize was an alligator. We all stood, soaking and staring at the carnage before us. The beast had begun to death roll, and Lenny's screams came in cycles, and he repeatedly breached and was then dragged under the water. Those same screams still rattle away in my nightmares whenever my mind dares to dream. His dying breath was carried as a bubble to the black water surface. Within a minute, maybe less, the white froth brought up by the thrashing had dissipated. Our collective gaze followed the disturbance in the water as it slowly moved away, off towards the tangle of mangroves. Rob fell to his knees by my side and sobbed gently into his hands. I heard Patrick gulp and turned to watch him wordlessly walk away from us, back in the direction of the trail. Marv and I helped Rob to his unsteady feet and followed Patrick. As soon as we caught up to him, he whipped around and furiously warned us not to tell a soul what had happened tonight. I was inclined to follow his advice, as was Marv, but we both knew Rob couldn't. Patrick sighed and took Rob by his forearm and led him away from us. I looked at Marv confused, but he just shrugged. A small while later, the two returned. Rob was crying with even more devastation now, and Patrick just sniffed indifferently. When I returned home that night, just 15 minutes past midnight, my mother immediately knew something was wrong. Despite her persistence, I explained to her that I was blackout tired. And as it was over 3 hours past my bedtime, she let me go to sleep as soon as I came through the door. I cried for most of the night and stayed awake long enough to hear sirens wailing from, I assumed, Rob's house. In the morning, my mother came into my room and quietly sat on my bed. She told me in a soft and distant voice that Lenny, the little brother of my friend Rob, had been reported missing. She then asked me if I knew anything about it. I told her in a shaky voice that I didn't, and my reply was followed by a few minutes of silence. My mother then leaned in and hugged me. I started to cry into her shoulder, and after some point she pulled away, gave me a shallow smile, and left my room. They never found Lenny, of course, nor did they find his remains. I didn't see Rob much after that night, but I often heard from my parents that Lenny's mother and father had shattered. I stayed friends with Marv until I moved to Baton Rouge at 19. I rarely visited my hometown, but recently my mother passed away. I haven't spoken to her in years, let alone seen her in person. The funeral was organized by my sister, who now lived in the family home with her own family. I stayed with her for a week or two during the mourning period and got to know my nieces and nephews properly for the first time. A few days ago, I was browsing around a local shop, one I worked at in the summer of 1990. It hadn't changed much, and I realized the new owner was an old school friend of mine. I was walking down aisle 3 when I bumped into him. I almost didn't recognize him at first, but he recognized me. It was Rob. Guilt still clung to him like kudzu. I could tell it in his gray eyes and broken smile. His hands trembled as he restocked a shelf of canned goods, his wedding ring loose on his thinning fingers. He somehow seemed smaller than he was when we were 13. We talked and vowed to talk more again one day, then said our goodbyes. I'm still not sure how much detail he told his parents of what happened that night, or if he's ever made peace with his own conscience. This post is my own admission. I'm not sure if the stories of Leatherskin are true. I did, however, tell them to my young nieces and nephews, in the hope they'll never venture near the swamp. Alligators infest these waters, and I'm certain it was one of those beasts that killed Lenny that night. I mean, what else could it be?